So Assassin's Creed Valhalla is finally here, and looking back on my yearly calendar, few release dates were more heavily circled on that calendar than Valhalla. Now, over the course of the past week, I have logged over 40 hours of gameplay. I've hit several of the dream sequences, conquered and allied myself with about half of England, tried some of the side missions, various open world encounters, raided and pillaged to my heart's desire, and I can honestly say that I am pleased to give this game my recommendation. Now, Valhalla is probably going to end up being a very polarizing title in the sense that for the traditional Assassin's Creed fans, you know, those that remember with longing the days of Ezio, the Kenways, and Arno, this will be their proverbial dagger in the heart. Valhalla has made the full transition from its AC roots of tight cityscapes and directed sequences, hiding in plain sight and all that entails with the following of the Creed, and it has gone full open world battle sim with visceral mass scale combat sequences that harken to God of War. And at this point, I don't see a way back to its original Assassin's Creed format, and you know what? I'm okay with that. You see, Valhalla has done some interesting things in terms of its alliance format with its introduction and advancement of the dream sequence mechanics, and all of this really creates an Odyssey-esque environment, but with an open world experience that sort of dispenses with all the bullshit and meaningless side missions, and it really brings story arcs with weight and meaning along with optional activities that are time period specific and add to the overall immersion factor. And it really earns my respect for the care and hunger for detail that the open world is able to bring to life. But at the same time, there are some glaring issues that really stand out in terms of how the game performs and the focus and direction of the narrative line, which is truly a strength of previous AC titles. Valhalla tells an interesting tale, but at times it really gets lost in a whole host of parallel running narratives, and you find yourself entertained but completely lost in terms of progressing towards the end result. You see, at times it can feel disconnected and unfocused, and when it does, it really sticks out. Because what I feel is the core of every Assassin's Creed game, the ability to tell a compelling and believable story grounded in fact, with a bit of contextual liberty, is there and vividly brought to life in Valhalla. It just gets a bit lost in the overwhelming amount of input and available content present in the game. So, let's pull back the curtain and take a deeper look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So let's begin with a bit of number crunching and performance. And if you've ever played an Assassin's Creed title, especially from Unity in late 2014 up until now, Valhalla, you've seen immense environments brought to life through the use of Ubisoft's Anvil Next 2.0 engine. And I mention this fact because early on, even before Valhalla launched, I have to admit I was a bit concerned with the suggested PC performance specs. You see, when the specs were released, it showed the ultra settings pushing 4K, but at just 30 FPS, and everyone was like, that's it? I mean, this is 2020, and with the level of hardware available to PC gamers, we should be pushing tremendous frame rates no matter how much load we put our rigs under, providing we have the proper hardware to handle it. So it's important to know that for my recordings, I went in and cranked up every single setting I could find to full maximum. I mean, I went all in to see if my rig could handle it, even with my somewhat older 1080 Ti graphics cards. And it did, although I did have to enable the adaptive quality setting that adjusted the resolution in resource-heavy areas so that I could record in 60 FPS. Items of note is the lack of ray tracing, or DLSS, which may have been absent for me, as my graphics cards would not support it, but I would have thought that if it were a feature in the game, it would have at least shown as grayed out in my menus, and it wasn't. Still, through the use of the adaptive resolution option, I was pretty much able to nail my frame rates at 60 FPS and hold steady at that mark. And you're probably asking why I'm not reaching into the 100 plus FPS range, and that is because I set my frame rate limiter to 60 so that the Nvidia ShadowPlay capture device could handle the volume of input I was running through it. Still, holding steady at 60 FPS at a resolution of 1440p while using graphics cards that are getting a bit dated is pretty freaking awesome. And I would expect the game to run even better once Nvidia releases drivers dedicated to improving performance for this specific game. At this point, I wanted to mention Watch Dogs Legion, a game that I just finished reviewing several weeks ago, and how barren Valhalla's graphics customization menu looks in comparison to Legion. You see, Valhalla seems to have cut out about half of the graphics customization menu and kind of resorted to keeping it automated within broader settings. And I bring this fact up because with Legion, I was able to go in and really play around with the individual settings and then test them out in the benchmark program to zero in on what my PC was capable of maintaining for optimal performance. Valhalla gives you a bit of flexibility with the main categories like shadows and textures, but when you test it out in the benchmark, it runs with an unchecked frame rate cap, and it makes it exceedingly more difficult to reach that happy medium of performance and quality. Now, as I said, I ended up activating the adaptive quality settings in the menu, more due to a feeling of exasperation than anything, although it seems to have done the job. Since I started my review, I haven't spoken to anyone else testing the game, so I don't know if they have had the same graphics issues as I did, but there you go. So with that all out of the way, let's talk about the world of Valhalla. This game is capable of producing some truly stunning visual experiences, and for anyone that is going to be playing Valhalla on next-gen console, it is really going to showcase how beautiful this game truly is. I mean, once you reach the top of some of the mountain ranges and get a chance to take in the size and the scope of the world, the beautiful sunlight coming in over the mountains at daybreak, I mean, it really is gorgeous and can serve as a benchmark for that next-gen experience, especially when it comes to the open world as large and expansive as this one. Now, as I mentioned, one item missing is ray tracing, and in an open world experience that features so many reflective surfaces like the snowbanks, metals in the weaponry and accessories, or even the ice itself, it could have taken the visual experience into super overdrive. England itself is very well done with the different shires and biomes it produces. As you can see in the southern portions, where it's a bit more flat with rolling hills, marshes, and the coastlines, and then as you gradually travel north, you get into higher altitudes and of course colder environments. All in all, Valhalla is breathtaking as it mixes ancient architecture and this sort of mystical glow into a stunning package. Interwoven into the landscapes of Valhalla are the remnants of the Roman occupation. I mean, there are destroyed aqueducts, colosseums, temples, and you get a true visual of just how enormous and grand these structures are. Throughout the countryside, there are even older monuments and rock structures, and it really adds to the ancient feel of this land. Within this mix of older civilizations that have come and gone along with the current populations and inhabitants, it creates this sense of identity and mysticism, as these people live and prosper within the ruins of civilizations that have long since left the earth. There is also this heavy presence of religion, as you see the influence of Christianity throughout the open world in the form of churches and the settlements surrounding them, in contrast to the pagan religion of the Norse and their totems and statues dedicated to their many gods. And like the differing regions of England, it gives a distinct feel to an area once you enter it. And this brings us to the open world structure of Valhalla. And like previous AC titles, the action and activities tend to be more centralized to urban environments, but there is still plenty to engage with outside the city limits, so to speak. So there are 4 territories of England during this time period, and then they are divided into smaller shires or territories. Each one of these shires has its own leader, occupying factions, and each of these start out of your influence, and through the use of the alliance map, you travel to these individual territories and attempt to gain their favor through a series of tasks. Now, long story short, they usually involve you assisting the current leader or getting rid of the current leader if the zone is ruled over by an enemy faction, and if you are successful, you will gain the allegiance of the leadership and they will have your back when the call comes in. Now, one of the real gems of Valhalla are these alliance story arcs, as they really are individually crafted as one-offs. They're all unique. They all have individualized factions, both friendly and enemy, and they all have very unique and interesting dialogue, and within that, cutscenes. One series of these territory subtasks involved me helping out a displaced Norse leader, kind of getting her back on her feet after a group of invading Saxons ransacked her town. We had to push out the occupying force, retake her city, and then I was dispatched to find out which of her trusted lieutenants was responsible for getting that invading force of Saxons into the city. So I was essentially tasked with rooting out the spy. Now this set off a chain of events where I had to go investigate a series of differing areas using my Odin sight to see the invisible clues. I had to question a series of townfolk and even the lieutenants themselves. Now at the end of this investigation, I give the leader the name of the culprit I think committed the crime, and she executes this person on the spot. Now, since I was thorough and accused the correct lieutenant, I then earned the trust of not only the leader, but one of the remaining lieutenants, and she in turn asked to join my raiding crew for the rest of the game. So your choices have consequences in Valhalla. They can determine the fates of others, and it adds an interesting element to this title. Now within each Shire, there are 3 main types of activities which range from the collection of wealth, which is usually in the form of crafting ingots, all the way to special armors and weaponry, to the second type, which is mysteries, like solving portal mysteries after you've become completely loopy from eating shrooms, to the final type, which is gathering artifacts. The open world doesn't change much either way. I mean, it stays fairly static throughout the game, even if you've liberated an area, or formed an alliance with them, or even collected all the wealth-designated items within a specific Shire. Side activities throughout the open world include a drinking game where you attempt to slam down mead as fast as you can, trying to outpace your opponent, and the more you drink, of course, the more you start to stagger about. There are also various other games, and of course the Viking lyrical battle known as flighting. Now these are really kind of basic, but they involve you attempting to insult your opponent through verse, and sometimes they get kind of hilarious. However, if you win these, they add to your charisma rankings, which you will need if you want to try and leak or speak with conviction in some of the conversational choices later in the game. Now, instead of shanties, like we chased in Rogue or Black Flag, there are now these tattoo diagrams that involve you parkouring through a course to grab and add to your inventory. There is also the appearance of the Hidden Ones and the Order of Ancients, basically the early Assassins and Templars, but I don't really want to go into much detail here. I want you to experience it for yourself. But there is this collection of targets, much like we saw in Odyssey with the Cult of Cosmos, and these Order of Ancients also have their form of the mercenary structure, called Zealots, that roam specific Shires, and when you encounter these targets, they are extremely well armed and really become mini boss battles in the open world. The beauty of the territories, the Shires, and the open world really exist in several different planes. And part of this is superficial. I mean, you really can't engage with many of the buildings. They can be scaled, but you can't enter them. So in that regard, that beauty is only skin deep. Now, on the other hand, many of the smaller sort of tent cities and villages can be entered, and many of those structures have fleshed out interiors, so it really just depends on where you are and what you were attempting to do. In many regards, Valhalla is much like previous Assassin's Creed titles, and that it tries to hold your hand anytime you activate your map, or use Sunan, your raven in the sky that provides you with an aerial view. Ubisoft really seems to be cemented to this idea that they have to show a player exactly where every item is located on the minimap, other than some of the wealth items, and those can involve you finding alternate pathways to kind of get behind locked doors, but with a little searching you can eventually find those as well. There is even a portion of your settlement that can be constructed that will house the Cartographer, where you can purchase maps of Shires and it will show you any items you may have missed in your explorations. Now, the real core strength of Valhalla is this sort of interlacing of narrative lines and how in-depth each one of these threads truly are. You see, in this game, you are essentially existing on 3 different planes of existence simultaneously, and it serves to break up the narrative and keep it fresh. It can also get a bit confusing if you stay out of one narrative line for too long and you start to forget some of the details of items you may have covered in the past. First up, Layla returns from Odyssey along with her team, and they serve as this natural thread grounded in the happenings of the real world. Second up, you also have the history of Ivor, which you can choose as a male, female, or mix depending on the sequence. And third and final, you also have this dream state, where Ivor enters the realm of Valhalla and other realms through the eyes of someone else. Within both the narrative lines of Ivor and the dreamscape, you encounter all sorts of individuals or territories that will activate these sort of sub-stories. Some of these include like meeting the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok and other individuals that are really noteworthy. On the flip side, many of the characters that take up residence in your settlement tend to be pretty forgettable. I mean, they have like 1 or 2 moments in the spotlight, and then they become background noise, and the game swings pretty noticeably between these super interesting submissions and these sort of generic tasks that the Ravensthorpe residents ask you to perform. Even now, after 40 hours of gameplay in the bag, I can honestly look back on the individual storylines and submissions and pretty much remember everything I saw and did. It's all really that vivid. Some of these are kind of generic, but they overwhelmingly are meaningful arcs, and I think Valhalla really nailed this portion of the game design. Even when you're tasked with walking with an NPC to another point to begin another portion of the missions, Ivor has meaningful conversations that kind of give you a glimpse into his or her soul. Whereas Odyssey gave you unlimited yet unconsequential choices for interact, ranging from sleep with them, bribe them, or burn the entire village to the ground, Valhalla does much of the character development for you and allows you to make conversational choices in very limited quantities. And it really helps develop the character of Ivor within the framework of the game as the centralized protagonist and attempts to fix the do anything anywhere faults that Odyssey used to create a truly unremarkable character experience. Now, because the story kind of evolves before you, the conversations tend to be pretty believable. The lip syncing and verbal deliveries do work fine, but there is this distinct lack of facial animations as the characters tend to look somewhat stoic, even when speaking in animated or raised voices.
I am excited. You must hear it in my voice.
I personally picked using the female Ivor full-time, and in hindsight, this may have been a mistake, as she only speaks in this gravelly monotone that never really wavers, even if she is in the midst of an intense battle or in a romance option. Perhaps it is part of the charm of this female warrior, always serious, always prepared for battle, but it would have been nice to hear a bit more inflection in her vocal deliveries coupled with more facial expressions. Now, when taken in context and you grab a 30,000-foot view, the aggregate result is that it all just really works well together. But we're talking about an Assassin's Creed game, right? So bring on the combat. As I look back on my early hours within Valhalla, I was really struggling with Ivor and her lack of combat capabilities. And what it really came down to was the fact that I was attempting to play the game in a way it really wasn't intended to be played. You see, I had just come off a full playthrough of Revelations, and in that game, Ezio is literally in God mode from the very first seconds of the game, and I immediately then jumped into Valhalla thinking I could do the same thing. And I really struggled. Where I really started to settle into my own with Valhalla was in this first raiding mission, and this is several hours into the game. It really hit home that I wasn't going to be able to just go Super Saiyan and decimate my targets, but I would instead need to use a bit more of my surroundings and play more conservatively until I was able to level up my character's abilities and really gain some resilience and damage output. So instead, I stuck to cover, whistled for my targets to come investigate, and eventually took down enough targets from cover that I was able to make my final assault and eventually grab control of the village and the much needed resources. Now, I could have gone full stealth and really taken my time and downed each target individually, studying their pathings and waiting for that opportune moment to strike, or I could have gone full horn-blowing raid party with torches out and made a full frontal assault. Now, I could have even kept my distance and sniped down some targets with my bow, and really whatever way you want to finish the assaults, the game really gives you the flexibility to finish it the way you want. You can be that ultra-conservative player that takes their time, or the more impulsive and frenetic player that just goes crazy and lets the chips fall where they may. There is really quite a bit of spontaneity in the combat and the methods you choose, and the potency of your character is further enhanced through the use of the skill tree. You see, each time you level up in Valhalla, you receive a couple of skill points, and you can place these into really cool-looking constellations that serve as skill trees. So there are basically 3 schools of thought in these trees, and they vary across more melee-centric, stealth, or ranged combat. Now, you see, in Valhalla, you don't rank up your character strength through better and better gear, or even through the natural acquiring of better output through level ups, but instead, you are tasked with spending these skill points into their various skill trees. Each constellation has various abilities that connect through an intricate lacework of lines that first require you to unlock the perk leading up to the one you desire, and this really comes down to a bit of planning. Do I really want that melee damage in that constellation? Well, I'm first going to need to unlock this critical chance to get there, and so on and so on. There are also stronger abilities in the skill trees, like better evasion moves, detection, or even finisher moves like what looks like a curb stomp. The real gems in these constellations are the large unlocks, which for me, I chose to go the way of the bear, which really enhanced my melee abilities. And each time I unlocked a way of the bear skill, I picked up a laundry list of perks that added to my character's overall abilities. Now, a point that I really want to stress is that each constellation is made up of varied skills, so you can't just go for a full melee damage character, as you will unlock other perks to get those melee bonuses, and it really ends up with a character who does one combat skill pretty well, and the other two on average levels. Just to be clear, no matter what path you choose, you are always Ivor, just with differing core abilities, either a tendency towards better melee, stealth, or ranged damage. Major abilities require that you obtain books of knowledge that are sprinkled throughout the world, and once equipped, these can be used on a limited basis, usually if you have enough stamina in your stamina bars to activate them. Now, by far, these are the coolest and most devastating moves that Ivor can perform, from dual-wielding axe tosses all over the place to this crazy rage-driven charge where Ivor drives the target into a barrier and then uses an axe to decapitate the target in this really badass slow-mo move. Now, what I quickly came to realize is that Valhalla has really embraced this visceral God of War approach to combat and brought it firmly into the Assassin's Creed universe. When you are in the midst of battle, the point of view changes to be just a bit closer to your targets, and you kind of feel the sweatiness of the intensity and this maelstrom going on all around you, and it really leads to some intense and wild finishers. Valhalla combat is intense, brutal, and ultra-violent. Decapitations tend to be the norm, not the exception, and Ivor really leaves a swath of carnage in his or her wake. Exploding vats of flammable liquid litter your battle zones, along with plenty of arrows in case you need to restock. Now, depending on what Shire you are attacking, they could have heavier assault equipment to use against you, like variations of mechanical crossbows or even fire arrows. It is important to note that as you attack these various factions and engage them in combat, they use differing combat mechanics against you. Some use swords and shields, while others could be this wild man axe-throwing assassin. You will run into some targets that are more about counter moves and stealth, and then there are more of these boss enemy types that tend to be a bit larger than other targets, and they have unique abilities and enhanced resilience to your damage. Where this style of combat really culminates into total chaos and mayhem are these full frontal assaults, where you are attempting to finish a Shire story arc, and they normally involve controlling a battering ram to open a sequence of gates, all the while fighting in close proximity to huge numbers of ground troops and taking incoming fire from archers. Again, very God of War-esque. Not so much Assassin's Creed, but still, it is appropriate for the time period, and these are damn exciting to begin and finish successfully. I would also be remiss if I did not mention the fact that the long and distinctive parkour routes that have become synonymous with Assassin's Creed are back in Valhalla, but you're going to need to look for them. Now, unlike previous Assassin's Creed titles where the countryside and cities were literally overflowing with these zones, Valhalla has them, but they are a bit more hidden. Now, during this clip, you can see me where I find one of these routes in a settlement and easily transition from that distinctive angled down tree to the poles, to the rooftops, and eventually back down to the ground via an angled wagon. Also, the leap of faith will need to be learned a little bit later in the game, as Ivor is not familiar with that movement at the beginning of the game, but it will look and feel very familiar to Assassin's Creed faithful. Overall mission variance does not vary wildly. I mean, it's always going to involve taking down a sequence of targets to eventually activate that final battle for control of a Shire. But so far, I haven't seen any reuse of mechanics or bosses. And remember that I am just over 40 hours into this game. Now, in terms of combat, there is really only so much you can do with the weaponry available during this time period, but the finishers you can deploy during combat make for this constant barrage of violent uniqueness, as Ivor will pick up whatever weapon his or her target was previously carrying and then use it back against that target. Now, this could vary from grabbing a couple of axes and using them to pick up a target and then go ham on that target, all the way over to using heavy items like broadswords and great axes and going full Mortal Kombat. Now, for me, the story is the main attraction to Valhalla, but the visceral and varied combat that gives you the flexibility to do as you please really comes in a close second. Where Valhalla kicks it up a notch and really goes full God of War are these epic boss battles, and these look like they are really straight out of that genre of game. They usually involve you taking on some supersized beast or giant in a circle arena with walls around it. You have your normal resources that are sprinkled around the arena, like certain plants and flowers you eat to regain your health or stamina, and items like arrows to replenish your stock. Now, each boss has a series of weak points that you need to destroy so that your normal strikes will inflict enhanced damage, and as you whittle away at your target, they will gradually unleash varied and enhanced supers in your direction. Where these boss battles become really prevalent are in the dream sequences to Valhalla, and at times you feel like you're just jumping from one battle arena to another. Now, what became really frustrating is that in my desire to continue this dream sequence arc, I would jump into the next sequence for that arc, completely ignoring the suggested power level, and when I did reach the boss battle, I was badly overpowered for the battle. Only when I was able to perform and counter each boss mechanic flawlessly was I able to complete this battle despite the overwhelming odds against me. Now, if you go looking for trouble in the open world, you will quickly find something to engage in combat with, and this can vary from a pack of rabid wolves all the way up to faction troops, and then onto a zealot warrior that, if you are not the correct power level, will absolutely skin you alive. Now, where this world becomes a bit one-dimensional is just how much emphasis it places on combat. Yes, you can go looking for artifacts and crypts and items like that where it places an emphasis on routes and remembering the correct paths to take. Or maybe you need to move this item to get to this other item, then you can destroy this one and then move this first item back a few more feet to gain access to this other area, but by and large, Valhalla is about combat. I remember one mission where I was tasked with tailing a target, a staple of Assassin's Creed games, but the vast majority of my missions have involved eradicating areas of troops and reporting back to the task giver. You can kind of force yourself to perform the required task a bit more stealthily or from different ranges, but when push comes to shove, Ivor is all about tearing up targets with ruthless efficiency, all in an effort to get to the next interact and story progression. Any Ubisoft game would not be complete without a robust monetization model, and from what I can see, Valhalla will include a season pass, which apparently is going to contain several paid expansions and several new game modes. Now, as of the posting of this video, the price is yet unknown, but I'm going to guess that it's going to be in line with what we have seen from previous AC titles. Of course, the Valhalla store is chock full of cosmetic items that will require Helix credits to purchase. From what I can see, each 100 Helix credits will run you $1. And of course, the items and the Helix credits packs tend to differ. Now, for instance, the smallest Helix credits amount you can purchase is 500 credits, but some of the items only cost 300 credits, and there is no option to purchase exact or lesser amounts. So I'll leave you to decide how this is going. Just look at this face. I also found specific resource maps that cost 1,000 Helix credits. That amounts to $10. And once you purchase one of these maps, it will show every resource of that type on the map. And in a game that pushes open world exploration, I find this to be really lame. Now, thankfully, I saw no or what amounted to be necessary XP boosters, like we saw in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, because level ups in this game come pretty frequently and keep you in tune with the overall progression loop. Now, as you would expect, many of the coolest looking cosmetic items are locked behind this cringy paywall scheme, and as of yet, Valhalla hasn't made the same mistakes as Odyssey when it comes to monetization, but we will need to wait and see just how far this goes in the future. So the burning question I'm sure you want to ask is, how do I feel about this game after 40 hours in the universe of Assassin's Creed Valhalla? And I think the better question you need to be asking is, how does this title improve on Odyssey and kind of buck the trend of just being another Ubisoft created open world experience? So in some regards, this game is exactly what we have come to expect from Ubisoft. It has a map marker driven view that simultaneously overwhelms and attempts to hold the hands of the player, directing them to exactly where they need to go. The open world can be a bit lifeless and static unless you attempt to stir up conflict, and the AI that inhabit that world, outside of the ones you engage with, tend to be pretty lifeless and really poorly programmed. There is also a reworked level gating system that can be skirted around, but will require you to perform flawlessly when attempting to battle NPCs that are nearly double your power value. Now, where Valhalla really starts to redeem itself is in its complex and meaningful approach to interacting with the macro world. It pushes hard to tell a story, and in that regard, it does quite well. Also pretty rare for a Ubisoft title is the fact that other than some optimization issues with asset-rich areas, it tends to run pretty smoothly. I've had some nightmarish experiences with previous AC titles, and Valhalla is not one of them. There is also this new and super visceral combat loop that keeps your experiences fresh, and it tries to find a decent balance between your output and the ability to counter incoming NPC attacks. Stealth is there and it is available, but it feels like a bit of an afterthought, but you do get access to the vaunted hidden blade after a noted absence. The Alliance combat loops are propped up by interesting attack variances both on a macro and micro level, and that is something that Ubisoft isn't really known for, as they tend to introduce and reuse certain combat loops over and over. Now, this is still an RPG-like game, but a much more toned-down version of Odyssey in terms of the weakest facets of that installment, which were numerous, like lifeless interactions, meaningless side missions, etc. Now, in a way, Valhalla has completed the transition begun with Origins, from those tight, parkour-friendly environments to a more broad open-world experience, but it's really gotten back to the basics of what made this franchise memorable. Those great and believable stories with depth and emotion and character development, all interlaced with unique combat and freedom of movement. Do I recommend Valhalla to you? I do. I wasn't quite sure how I would feel about this title, but after diving in, I really can recommend it. From what I'm experiencing, Valhalla is going to reach the 100-hour mark for a real full completion, and if it continues on this path of providing meaningful experiences, it could be judged kindly in terms of previous Assassin's Creed giants like Assassin's Creed 2. Now, I'm not ready to place Ivor on par with Ezio, and if anything, that's going to take some time to sort of ferment and age, but the story and the vibe that Valhalla gives off certainly caught my attention. Anyway, that's going to wrap up my Assassin's Creed Valhalla review, and as always, I appreciate your feedback in the comment section below. Ask whatever you like, and if possible, I will answer you quickly and honestly. Subbing the channel and liking the video really helps me out. Patreon and Teespring links in the video description. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter for all my latest thoughts on most things gaming related. And until the next one, this is LtBuzzLitebeer, signing off.